Chapter 6 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 6. What Befell at the Queen's Ferry. As soon as we came to the inn, Ransom led us up the stair to a small room with a bed in it, and heated like an oven by a great fire of coal. At a table hard by the chimney, a tall, dark, sober-looking man sat writing. In spite of the heat of the room, he wore a thick sea-jacket, buttoned to the neck, and a tall, hairy cap drawn down over his ears. Yet I never saw any man, not even a judge upon the bench, look cooler or more studious and self-possessed than this ship captain. He got to his feet at once, and coming forward, offered his large hand to Ebenezer.
"I am proud to see you, Mr. Balfour," said he in a fine deep voice, "and glad that ye are here in time. The wind's fair, and the tide upon the turn. We'll see the old coal bucket burning on the Isle of May before tonight." "Captain Hoseason," returned my uncle, "you keep your room unco hot." "It's a habit I have, Mr. Balfour," said the skipper. "I'm a cold rife man by my nature. I have a cold blood, sir. There's neither fur nor flannel, no, sir, nor hot rum will warm up what they call the temperature. Sir, it's the same with most men that have been carbonadoed, as they call it, in the tropic seas." "Well, well, captain," replied my uncle, "we must all be the way we're made." But it chanced that this fancy of the captain's had a great share in my misfortunes. For though I had promised myself not to let my kinsman out of sight, I was both so impatient for a nearer look of the sea and so sickened by the closeness of the room that when he told me to "run downstairs and play myself a while," I was fool enough to take him at his word. Away I went, therefore, leaving the two men sitting down to a bottle and a great mass of papers, and crossing the road in front of the inn, walked down upon the beach. With the wind in that quarter, only little wavelets, not much bigger than I had seen upon a lake, beat upon the shore. But the weeds were new to me, some green, some brown and long, and some with little bladders that crackled between my fingers. Even so far up the firth, the smell of the sea-water was exceedingly salt and stirring. The Covenant, besides, was beginning to shake out her sails, which hung upon the yards in clusters, and the spirit of all that I beheld put me in thoughts of far voyages and foreign places. I looked, too, at the seamen with the skiff, big brown fellows, some in shirts, some with jackets, some with coloured handkerchiefs about their throats, one with a brace of pistols stuck into his pockets, 2 or 3 with knotty bludgeons, and all with their case-knives. I passed the time of day with one that looked less desperate than his fellows, and asked him of the sailing of the brig. He said they would get under way as soon as the ebb set, and expressed his gladness to be out of a port where there were no taverns and fiddlers, but all with such horrifying oaths that I made haste to get away from him. This threw me back on Ransom, who seemed the least wicked of that gang, and who soon came out of the inn and ran to me, crying for a bowl of punch. I told him I would give him no such thing, for neither he nor I was of an age for such indulgences. "But a glass of ale you may have, and welcome," says I. He mopped and mowed at me, and called me names, but he was glad to get the ale for all that, and presently we were set down at a table in the front room of the inn, and both eating and drinking with a good appetite. Here it occurred to me that, as the landlord was a man of that county, I might do well to make a friend of him. I offered him a share, as was much the custom in those days, but he was far too great a man to sit with such poor customers as Ransom and myself, and he was leaving the room, when I called him back to ask if he knew Mr. Rankeillor. "Hoot, ay," says he, "and a very honest man. And oh, by the by," says he, "was it you who came in with Ebenezer?" And when I told him yes, "Ye be no friend of his?" he asked, meaning in the Scottish way that I would be no relative. I told him no, none. "I thought not," said he. "And yet ye have a kind of gliff of Mr. Alexander."
I said it seemed that Ebenezer was ill seen in the country.
"Nae doubt," said the landlord. "He's a wicked old man, and there's many would like to see him girning in the tow. Jennet Clouston and many mair that he has harried out of house and hame. And yet he was once a fine young fellow too. But that was before the soft gaed abroad about Mr. Alexander. That was like the death of him."
"And what was it?" I asked.
"Oh, just that he had killed him," said the landlord. "Did ye never hear that?"
"And what would he kill him for?" said I.
"And what for, but just to get the place?" said he.
"The place?" said I. "The Shaws?"
"Nae other place that I ken," said he.
"Ay, man?" said I. "Is that so? Was Alexander the eldest son?"
"'Deed he was," said the landlord. "What else would he ha' killed him for?"
And with that he went away, as he had been impatient to do from the beginning. Of course, I had guessed it a long while ago, but it is one thing to guess, another to know; and I sat stunned with my good fortune, and could scarce grow to believe that the same poor lad who had trudged in the dust from Ettrick Forest not 2 days ago was now one of the rich of the earth, and had a house and broad lands, and might mount his horse to-morrow. All these pleasant things, and 1,000 others, crowded into my mind, as I sat staring before me out of the inn window, and paying no heed to what I saw, only I remember that my eye lighted on Captain Hoseason down on the pier among his seamen, and speaking with some authority; and presently he came marching back towards the house, with no mark of a sailor's clumsiness, but carrying his fine tall figure with a manly bearing, and still with the same sober, grave expression on his face. I wondered if it was possible that Ransom's stories could be true, and half disbelieved them, they fitted so ill with the man's looks. But indeed he was neither so good as I supposed him, nor quite so bad as Ransom did; for, in fact, he was 2 men, and left the better one behind as soon as he set foot on board his vessel. The next thing, I heard my uncle calling me, and found the pair in the road together. It was the captain who addressed me, and that with an air, very flattering to a young lad, of grave equality.
"Sir," says he, "Mr. Balfour tells me great things of you, and for my own part, I like your looks. I wish I was for longer here, that we might make the better friends; but we'll make the most of what we have. Ye shall come on board my brig for half an hour, till the ebb sets, and drink a bowl with me."
Now, I longed to see the inside of a ship more than words can tell, but I was not going to put myself in jeopardy, and I told him my uncle and I had an appointment with a lawyer.
"Ay, ay," said he. "He passed me word of that. But ye see, the boat'll set ye ashore at the town pier, and that's but a penny stone-cast from Rankeillor's house."
And here he suddenly leaned down and whispered in my ear,
"Take care of the old tod, he means mischief. Come aboard till I can get a word with ye."
And then, passing his arm through mine, he continued aloud, as he set off towards his boat,
"But come, what can I bring ye from the Carolinas? Any friend of Mr. Balfour's can command. A roll of tobacco? Indian featherwork? A skin of a wild beast? A stone pipe? The mocking-bird that mews for all the world like a cat? The cardinal bird that is as red as blood? Take your pick and say your pleasure."
By this time we were at the boat side, and he was handing me in. I did not dream of hanging back. I thought, the poor fool, that I had found a good friend and helper, and I was rejoiced to see the ship. As soon as we were all set in our places, the boat was thrust off from the pier and began to move over the waters; and what with my pleasure in this new movement and my surprise at our low position, and the appearance of the shores, and the growing bigness of the brig as we drew near to it, I could hardly understand what the captain said, and must have answered him at random. As soon as we were alongside, where I sat fairly gaping at the ship's height, the strong humming of the tide against its sides, and the pleasant cries of the seamen at their work, Hoseason, declaring that he and I must be the first aboard, ordered a tackle to be sent down from the mainyard. In this I was whipped into the air and set down again on the deck, where the captain stood ready waiting for me, and instantly slipped back his arm under mine. There I stood some while, a little dizzy with the unsteadiness of all around me, perhaps a little afraid, and yet vastly pleased with these strange sights, the captain meanwhile pointing out the strangest and telling me their names and uses. "But where is my uncle?" said I, suddenly. "Hi!" said Hoseason, with a sudden grimness. "That's the point." I felt I was lost. With all my strength I plucked myself clear of him and ran to the bulwarks. Sure enough, there was the boat pulling for the town, with my uncle sitting in the stern. I gave a piercing cry, "Help! Help! Murder!" so that both sides of the anchorage rang with it, and my uncle turned round where he was sitting, and showed me a face full of cruelty and terror. It was the last I saw. Already strong hands had been plucking me back from the ship's side, and now a thunderbolt seemed to strike me. I saw a great flash of fire, and fell senseless. End of chapter. Chapter 7 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 7. I go to sea in the brig Covenant of Dysart. I came to myself in darkness, in great pain, bound hand and foot and deafened by many unfamiliar noises. There sounded in my ears a roaring of water as of a huge mill dam, the thrashing of heavy sprays, the thundering of the sails, and the shrill cries of seamen. The whole world now heaved giddily up, and now rushed giddily downward, and so sick and hurt was I in body, and my mind so much confounded, that it took me a long while, chasing my thoughts up and down, and ever stunned again by a fresh stab of pain, to realize that I must be lying somewhere bound in the belly of that unlucky ship, and that the wind must have strengthened to a gale. With a clear perception of my plight there fell upon me a blackness of despair, a horror of remorse at my own folly, and a passion of anger at my uncle, that once more bereft me of my senses. When I returned again to life, the same uproar, the same confused and violent movements, shook and deafened me, and presently, to my other pains and distresses, there was added the sickness of an unused landsman on the sea. In that time of my adventurous youth I suffered many hardships, but none that was so crushing to my mind and body, or lit by so few hopes, as these first hours aboard the brig. I heard a gun fire, and supposed the storm had proved too strong for us, and we were firing signals of distress. The thought of deliverance, even by death in the deep sea, was welcome to me. Yet it was no such matter, but, as I was afterwards told, a common habit of the captain's, which I here set down to show that even the worst man may have his kindlier side. We were then passing, it appeared, within some miles of Dysart, where the brig was built, and where old Mrs. Hoseason, the captain's mother, had come some years before to live, and whether outward or inward bound, the Covenant was never suffered to go by that place by day without a gun fired and colours shown. I had no measure of time. Day and night were alike in that ill-smelling cavern of the ship's bowels, where I lay, and the misery of my situation drew out the hours to double. How long, therefore, I lay waiting to hear the ship split upon some rock, or to feel her reel head foremost into the depths of the sea, I have not the means of computation. But sleep at length stole from me the consciousness of sorrow. I was awakened by the light of a hand-lantern shining in my face. A small man of about 30, with green eyes and a tangle of fair hair, stood looking down at me. "Well," said he,
How goes it?" I answered by a sob, and my visitor then felt my pulse and temples, and set himself to wash and dress the wound upon my scalp. "Ay," said he, "a sore dunt. What, man? Cheer up! The world's no done. You've made a bad start of it, but you'll make a better. Have you had any meat?" I said I could not look at it, and thereupon he gave me some brandy and water in a tin pannikin, and left me once more to myself. The next time he came to see me, I was lying betwixt sleep and waking, my eyes wide open in the darkness, the sickness quite departed, but succeeded by a horrid giddiness and swimming that were almost worse to bear. I ached besides in every limb, and the cords that bound me seemed to be of fire. The smell of the hole in which I lay seemed to have become a part of me, and during the long interval since his last visit I had suffered tortures of fear, now from the scurrying of the ship's rats, that sometimes pattered on my very face, and now from the dismal imaginings that haunt the bed of fever. The glimmer of the lantern, as a trap opened, shone in like the heaven's sunlight, and though it only showed me the strong dark beams of the ship that was my prison, I could have cried aloud for gladness. The man with the green eyes was the first to descend the ladder, and I noticed that he came somewhat unsteadily. He was followed by the captain. Neither said a word, but the first set to and examined me, and dressed my wound as before, while Hoseason looked me in my face with an odd black look. "Now, sir, you'll see for yourself," said the first. "A high fever, no appetite, no light, no meat. You see for yourself what that means." "I am no conjurer, Mr. Riach," said the captain. "Give me leave, sir," said Riach. "You've a good head upon your shoulders, and a good Scotch tongue to ask with, but I will leave you no manner of excuse. I want that boy taken out of this hole, and put in the forecastle." "What ye may want, sir, is a matter of concern to nobody but yourself," returned the captain. "But I can tell you that which is to be. Here he is, here he shall bide." "Admitting that you have been paid in proportion," said the other, "I will crave leave humbly to say that I have not. Paid I am, and none too much, to be the second officer of this old tub, and you ken very well if I do my best to earn it. But I was paid for nothing more." "If ye could hold back your hand from the tin pan, Mr. Riach, I would have no complaint to make of ye," returned the skipper. "And instead of asking riddles, I make bold to say that you would hold your breath to cool your porridge. Will be required on deck," he added in a sharper note, and set one foot upon the ladder. But Mr. Riach caught him by the sleeve. "Admitting that you've been paid to do a murder," he began. Hoseason turned upon him with a flash. "What's that?" he cried. "What kind of talk is that?" "It seems it is the talk that you can understand," said Mr. Riach, looking him steadily in the face. "Mr. Riach, I have sailed with ye 3 cruises," replied the captain. "In all that time, sir, ye should have learned to know me. I'm a stiff man and a dour man, but for what ye say the now, fie, fie! It comes from a bad heart and a black conscience. If ye say the lad will die—" "Ay, he will," said Mr. Riach. "Well, sir, is that not enough?" said Hoseason. "Flit him where ye please." Thereupon the captain ascended the ladder, and I, who had lain silent throughout this strange conversation, beheld Mr. Riach turn after bow as low as to his knees in what was plainly a spirit of derision. Even in my then state of sickness I perceived 2 things: that the mate was touched with liquor, as the captain hinted, and that, drunk or sober, he was like to prove a valuable friend. 5 minutes afterwards my bonds were cut, I was hoisted on a man's back, carried up to the forecastle, and laid in a bunk on some sea blankets, where the first thing that I did was to lose my senses. It was a blessed thing indeed to open my eyes again upon the daylight, and to find myself in the society of men. The forecastle was a roomy place enough, set all about with berths, in which the men of the watch below were seated smoking, or lying down asleep. The day being calm and the wind fair, the scuttle was open,
and not only the good daylight, but from time to time, as the ship rolled, a dusty beam of sunlight shone in, and dazzled and delighted me. I had no sooner moved, moreover, than one of the men brought me a drink of something healing which Mr. Riach had prepared, and bade me lie still, and I should soon be well again. There were no bones broken, he explained. A clour on the head were naething. Man, said he, it was me that gave it ye. Here I lay for the space of many days a close prisoner, and not only got my health again, but came to know my companions. They were a rough lot indeed, as sailors mostly are, being men rooted out of all the kindly parts of life, and condemned to toss together on the rough seas with masters no less cruel. There were some among them that had sailed with the pirates, and seen things it would be a shame even to speak of. Some were men that had run from the king's ships, and went with a halter round their necks, of which they made no secret, and all, as the saying goes, were at a word and a blow with their best friends. Yet I had not been many days shut up with them before I began to be ashamed of my first judgment, when I had drawn away from them at the Ferry pier, as though they had been unclean beasts. No class of man is altogether bad, but each has its own faults and virtues, and these shipmates of mine were no exception to the rule. Rough they were, sure enough, and bad, I suppose, but they had many virtues. They were kind when it occurred to them, simple even beyond the simplicity of a country lad like me, and had some glimmerings of honesty. There was one man, of maybe 40, that would sit on my berthside for hours and tell me of his wife and child. He was a fisher that had lost his boat, and thus been driven to the deep sea voyaging. Well, it is years ago now, but I have never forgotten him. His wife, who was young by him, as he often told me, waited in vain to see her man return. He would never again make the fire for her in the morning, nor yet keep the bairn when she was sick. Indeed, many of these poor fellows, as the event proved, were upon their last cruise. The deep seas and cannibal fish receive them, and it is a thankless business to speak ill of the dead. Among other good deeds that they did, they returned my money, which had been shared among them, and though it was about a third short, I was very glad to get it, and hoped great good from it in the land I was going to. The ship was bound for the Carolinas, and you must not suppose that I was going to that place merely as an exile. The trade was even then much depressed, since that, and with the rebellion of the colonies and the formation of the United States, it has, of course, come to an end. But in those days of my youth, white men were still sold into slavery on the plantations, and that was the destiny to which my wicked uncle had condemned me. The cabin boy Ransom, from whom I had first heard of these atrocities, came in at times from the Roundhouse, where he berthed and served, now nursing a bruised limb in silent agony, now raving against the cruelty of Mr. Shuan. It made my heart bleed, but the men had a great respect for the chief mate, who was, as they said, the only seaman of the whole jing-bang, and none such a bad man when he was sober. Indeed, I found there was a strange peculiarity about our two mates, that Mr. Riach was sullen, unkind, and harsh when he was sober, and Mr. Shuan would not hurt a fly except when he was drinking. I asked about the captain, but I was told drink made no difference upon that man of iron. I did my best in the small time allowed me to make something like a man, or rather, I should say something like a boy, of the poor creature, Ransom. But his mind was scarce truly human. He could remember nothing of the time before he came to sea, only that his father had made clocks, and had a starling in the parlour, which could whistle the North Country. All else had been blotted out in these years of hardship and cruelties. He had a strange notion of the dry land, picked up from sailors' stories, that it was a place where lads were put to some kind of slavery called a trade, and where apprentices were continually lashed and clapped into foul prisons. In a town, he thought every second person a decoy, and every third house a place in which seamen would be drugged and murdered. To be sure, I would tell him how kindly I had myself been used upon that dry land he was so much afraid of, and how well fed and carefully taught both by my friends and my parents. And if he had been recently hurt, he would weep bitterly and swear to run away; but if he was in his usual crack-brain humour, or, still more, if he had had a glass of spirits in the Roundhouse, he would deride the notion. It was Mr. Riach, heaven forgive him, who gave the boy drink, and it was, doubtless, kindly meant; but besides that it was ruin to his health, it was the pitifullest thing in life to see this unhappy, unfriended creature staggering, and dancing, and talking he knew not what. Some of the men laughed, but not all; others would grow as black as thunder, thinking perhaps of their own childhood or their own children, and bid him stop that nonsense, and think what he was doing. As for me, I felt ashamed to look at him, and the poor child still comes about me in my dreams. All this time, you should know, the Covenant was meeting continual head winds and tumbling up and down against head seas, so that the scuttle was almost constantly shut, and the forecastle lighted only by a swinging lantern on a beam. There was constant labour for all hands; the sails had to be made and shortened every hour; the strain told on the men's temper; there was a growl of quarrelling all day long from berth to berth; and as I was never allowed to set my foot on deck, you can picture to yourselves how weary of my life I grew to be, and how impatient for a change. And a change I was to get, as you shall hear; but I must first tell of a conversation I had with Mr. Riach, which put a little heart in me to bear my troubles. Getting him in a favourable stage of drink, for indeed he never looked near me when he was sober, I pledged him to secrecy, and told him my whole story. He declared it was like a ballad; that he would do his best to help me; that I should have paper, pen, and ink, and write one line to Mr. Campbell and another to Mr. Rankeillor; and that if I had told the truth, 10 to 1 he would be able, with their help, to pull me through and set me in my rights. "And in the meantime," says he, "keep your heart up. You're not the only one, I'll tell you that. There's many a man hoeing tobacco overseas that should be mounting his horse at his own door at home; many and many. And life is all a variorum, at the best. Look at me. I'm a laird's son, and more than half a doctor; and here I am, man Jack to Hoseason." I thought it would be civil to ask him for a story. He whistled loud. "Never had one," said he. "I like fun, that's all." And he skipped out of the forecastle. End of chapter. Chapter 8 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 8. The Roundhouse. One night about 11 o'clock, a man of Mr. Riach's watch, which was on deck, came below for his jacket, and instantly there began to go a whisper about the forecastle that Shuan had done for him at last. There was no need of a name; we all knew who was meant; but we had scarce time to get the idea rightly in our heads, far less to speak of it, when the scuttle was again flung open, and Captain Hoseason came down the ladder. He looked sharply round the bunks in the tossing light of the lantern, and then, walking straight up to me, he addressed me, to my surprise, in tones of kindness. "My man," said he, "we want ye to serve in the Roundhouse. You and Ransome are to change berths. Run away aft with ye." Even as he spoke, 2 seamen appeared in the scuttle, carrying Ransome in their arms; and the ship at that moment giving a great sheer into the sea, and the lantern swinging, the light fell direct on the boy's face. It was white as wax, and had a look upon it like a dreadful smile. The blood in me ran cold, and I drew in my breath as if I had been struck. "Run away aft! Run away aft with ye!" cried Hoseason. And at that I brushed by the sailors and the boy, who neither spoke nor moved, and ran up the ladder on deck. The brig was sheering swiftly and giddily through a long cresting swell. She was on the starboard tack, and on the left hand, under the arched foot of the foresail, I could see the sunset still quite bright. This, at such an hour of the night, surprised me greatly, but I was too ignorant to draw the true conclusion, that we were going north about round Scotland, and were now on the high sea between the Orkney and Shetland Islands, having avoided the dangerous currents of the Pentland Firth. For my part, who had been so long shut in the dark, and knew nothing of head winds, I thought we might be half way or more across the Atlantic; and indeed, beyond that I wondered a little at the lateness of the sunset light. I gave no heed to it, pushed on across the decks, running between the seas, catching at ropes, and only saved from going overboard by one of the hands on deck, who had always been kind to me. The Roundhouse, for which I was bound, and where I was now to sleep and serve, stood some 6 feet above the decks, and, considering the size of the brig, was of good dimensions. Inside was a fixed table and bench, and 2 berths, one for the captain, and the other for the 2 mates, turn and turn about. It was all fitted with lockers from top to bottom, so as to stow away the officers' belongings and a part of the ship's stores. There was a second store-room underneath, which you entered by a hatchway in the middle of the deck. Indeed, all the best of the meat and drink and the whole of the powder were collected in this place, and all the firearms, except the 2 pieces of brass ordnance, were set in a rack in the aftermost wall of the roundhouse. The most of the cutlasses were in another place. A small window with a shutter on each side, and a skylight in the roof, gave it light by day, and after dark there was a lamp always burning. It was burning when I entered, not brightly, but enough to show Mr. Shuan sitting at the table, with the brandy bottle and a tin pannikin in front of him. He was a tall man, strongly made and very black, and he stared before him on the table like one stupid. He took no notice of my coming in, nor did he move when the captain followed and leant on the berth beside me, looking darkly at the mate. I stood in great fear of Hoseason, and had my reasons for it, but something told me I need not be afraid of him just then, and I whispered in his ear, "How is he?" He shook his head like one that does not know and does not wish to think, and his face was very stern. Presently Mr. Riach came in. He gave the captain a glance that meant the boy was dead as plain as speaking, and took his place like the rest of us, so that we all 3 stood without a word, staring down at Mr. Shuan, and Mr. Shuan, on his side, sat without a word, looking hard upon the table. All of a sudden he put out his hand to take the bottle, and at that Mr. Riach started forward and caught it away from him, rather by surprise than violence, crying out with an oath that there had been too much of this work altogether, and that a judgment would fall upon the ship. And as he spoke, the weather sliding doors standing open, he tossed the bottle into the sea. Mr. Shuan was on his feet in a trice. He still looked dazed, but he meant murder, ay, and would have done it, for the second time that night, had not the captain stepped in between him and his victim. "Sit down!" roars the captain. "You sotted swine, do you know what you've done? You've murdered the boy!" Mr. Shuan seemed to understand, for he sat down again, and put up his hand to his brow. "Well," he said, "he brought me a dirty pannikin." At that word, the captain and I and Mr. Riach all looked at each other for a second with a kind of frightened look, and then Hoseason walked up to his chief officer, took him by the shoulder, led him across to his bunk, and bade him lie down and go to sleep, as you might speak to a bad child. The murderer cried a little, but he took off his sea boots and obeyed. "Ha!" cried Mr. Riach, with a dreadful voice. "You should have interfered long since. It's too late now." "Mr. Riach," said the captain, "this night's work must never be kent in Dysart. The boy went overboard, sir. That's what the story is, and I would give £5 out of my pocket it was true." He turned to the table. "What made you throw the good bottle away?" he added. "There was no sense in that, sir. Here, David, draw me another. They're in the bottom locker." And he tossed me a key.
You'll need a glass yourself, sir," he added to Riach. "Yon was an ugly thing to see." So the pair sat down and hobnobbed, and while they did so, the murderer, who had been lying and whimpering in his berth, raised himself upon his elbow and looked at them and at me. That was the first night of my new duties, and in the course of the next day I had got well into the run of them. I had to serve at the meals, which the captain took at regular hours, sitting down with the officer who was off duty. All the day through I would be running with a dram to one or other of my three masters, and at night I slept on a blanket thrown on the deck boards at the aftermost end of the roundhouse, and right in the draught of the two doors. It was a hard and a cold bed, nor was I suffered to sleep without interruption, for some one would always be coming in from deck to get a dram, and when a fresh watch was to be set, two and sometimes all three would sit down and brew a bowl together. How they kept their health I know not, any more than how I kept my own. And yet in other ways it was an easy service. There was no cloth to lay; the meals were either of oatmeal porridge or salt junk, except twice a week, when there was duff, and though I was clumsy enough and, not being firm on my sea legs, sometimes fell with what I was bringing them, both Mr. Riach and the captain were singularly patient. I could not but fancy they were making up leeway with their consciences, and that they would scarce have been so good with me if they had not been worse with Ransome. As for Mr. Shuan, the drink or his crime, or the two together, had certainly troubled his mind. I cannot say I ever saw him in his proper wits. He never grew used to my being there, stared at me continually. Sometimes I could have thought with terror, and more than once drew back from my hand when I was serving him. I was pretty sure from the first that he had no clear mind of what he had done, and on my second day in the roundhouse I had the proof of it. We were alone, and he had been staring at me a long time, when all at once up he got as pale as death and came up close to me, to my great terror. But I had no cause to be afraid of him. "You were not here before?" he asked. "No, sir," said I. "There was another boy?" he asked again, and when I had answered him, "Ah," says he, "I thought that," and went and sat down, without another word, except to call for brandy. You may think it strange, but for all the horror I had, I was still sorry for him. He was a married man, with a wife in Leith, but whether or no he had a family I have now forgotten. I hope not. Altogether it was no very hard life for the time it lasted, which, as you are to hear, was not long. I was as well fed as the best of them; even their pickles, which were the great dainty, I was allowed my share of, and had I liked I might have been drunk from morning to night, like Mr. Shuan. I had company too, and good company of its sort. Mr. Riach, who had been to the college, spoke to me like a friend when he was not sulking, told me many curious things, and some that were informing; and even the captain, though he kept me at the stick's end the most part of the time, would sometimes unbuckle a bit, and tell me of the fine countries he had visited. The shadow of poor Ransome, to be sure, lay on all four of us, and on me and Mr. Shuan in particular, most heavily. And then I had another trouble of my own. Here I was, doing dirty work for three men that I looked down upon, and one of whom, at least, should have been hung upon a gallows. That was for the present, and as for the future, I could only see myself slaving alongside of negroes in the tobacco fields. Mr. Riach, perhaps from caution, would never suffer me to say another word about my story. The captain, whom I tried to approach, rebuffed me like a dog, and would not hear a word; and as the days came and went, my heart sank lower and lower, till I was even glad of the work which kept me from thinking. End of chapter. Chapter 9 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 9. The Man with the Belt of Gold. More than a week went by, in which the ill luck that had hitherto pursued the Covenant upon this voyage grew yet more strongly marked. Some days she made a little way, others she was driven actually back. At last we were beaten so far to the south that we tossed and tacked to and fro the whole of the 9th day, within sight of Cape Wrath and the wild rocky coast on either hand of it. There followed on that a council of the officers, and some decision which I did not rightly understand, seeing only the result, that we had made a fair wind of a foul one, and were running south. The 10th afternoon there was a falling swell and a thick, wet, white fog that hid one end of the brig from the other. All afternoon, when I went on deck, I saw men and officers listening hard over the bulwarks. For breakers, they said, and though I did not so much as understand the word, I felt danger in the air, and was excited. Maybe about 10 at night, I was serving Mr. Riach and the captain at their supper, when the ship struck something with a great sound, and we heard voices singing out. My two masters leaped to their feet. "She's struck," said Mr. Riach. "No, sir," said the captain. "We've only run a boat down." And they hurried out. The captain was in the right of it. We had run down a boat in the fog, and she had parted in the midst and gone to the bottom with all her crew but one. This man, as I heard afterwards, had been sitting in the stern as a passenger, while the rest were on the benches rowing. At the moment of the blow, the stern had been thrown into the air, and the man, having his hands free, and for all he was encumbered with a frieze overcoat that came below his knees, had leaped up and caught hold of the brig's bowsprit. It showed he had luck and much agility and unusual strength, that he should have thus saved himself from such a pass. And yet, when the captain brought him into the Roundhouse, and I set eyes on him for the first time, he looked as cool as I did. He was smallish in stature, but well set, and as nimble as a goat. His face was of a good open expression, but sunburnt very dark, and heavily freckled and pitted with the smallpox. His eyes were unusually light, and had a kind of dancing madness in them, that was both engaging and alarming. And when he took off his greatcoat, he laid a pair of fine silver-mounted pistols on the table, and I saw that he was belted with a great sword. His manners, besides, were elegant, and he pledged the captain handsomely. Altogether I thought of him, at the first sight, that here was a man I would rather call my friend than my enemy. The captain, too, was taking his observations, but rather of the man's clothes than his person. And to be sure, as soon as he had taken off the greatcoat, he showed forth mighty fine for the roundhouse of a merchant brig, having a hat with feathers, a red waistcoat, breeches of black plush, and a blue coat with silver buttons and handsome silver lace. Costly clothes, though somewhat spoiled with the fog and being slept in.
"I'm vexed, sir, about the boat," said the captain. "There are some pretty men gone to the bottom," said the stranger, "that I would rather see on the dry land again than half a score of boats." "Friends of yours?" said Hoseason. "You have none such friends in your country," was the reply. "They would have died for me like dogs." "Well, sir," said the captain, still watching him, "there are more men in the world than boats to put them in." "And that's true too," cried the other. "And ye seem to be a gentleman of great penetration." "I have been in France, sir," says the captain, so that it was plain he meant more by the words than showed upon the face of them. "Well, sir," says the other, "and so has many a pretty man, for the matter of that." "No doubt, sir," says the captain, "and fine coats." "Oho!" says the stranger. "Is that how the wind sets?" And he laid his hand quickly on his pistols. "Don't be hasty," said the captain. "Don't do a mischief before you see the need of it. You've a French soldier's coat upon your back, and a Scotch tongue in your head, to be sure. But so has many an honest fellow these days, and I dare say none the worse of it." "So?" said the gentleman in the fine coat. "Are ye of the honest party?" Meaning, was he a Jacobite? For each side in these sort of civil broils takes the name of honesty for its own. "Why, sir," replied the captain, "I am a true blue Protestant, and I thank God for it." It was the first word of any religion I had ever heard from him, but I learnt afterwards he was a great church-goer while on shore. "But for all that," says he, "I can be sorry to see another man with his back to the wall." "Can ye so, indeed?" asked the Jacobite. "Well, sir, to be quite plain with ye, I am one of those honest gentlemen that were in trouble about the years '45 and '6, and, to be still quite plain with ye, if I got into the hands of any of the red-coated gentry, it's like it would go hard with me. Now, sir, I was for France, and there was a French ship cruising here to pick me up, but she gave us the go-by in the fog, as I wish from the heart that ye had done yourself. And the best that I can say is this: if ye can set me ashore where I was going, I have that upon me will reward you highly for your trouble." "In France?" says the captain. "No, sir, that I cannot do. But where ye come from, we might talk of that." And then, unhappily, he observed me standing in my corner, and packed me off to the galley to get supper for the gentlemen. I lost no time, I promise you, and when I came back into the roundhouse, I found the gentleman had taken a money belt from about his waist, and poured out a guinea or two upon the table. The captain was looking at the guineas, and then at the belt, and then at the gentleman's face, and I thought he seemed excited. "Half of it," he cried, "and I'm your man." The other swept back the guineas into the belt, and put it on again under his waistcoat. "I have told you, sir," said he, "that not one doit of it belongs to me. It belongs to my chieftain." And here he touched his hat. "And while I would be but a silly messenger to grudge some of it that the rest might come safe, I should show myself a hound indeed if I bought my own carcass any too dear. 30 guineas on the sea-side, or 60 if ye set me on the Linnhe Loch. Take it if ye will; if not, ye can do your worst." "Ay," said Hoseason, "and if I give ye over to the soldiers?" "Ye would make a fool's bargain," said the other. "My chief, let me tell you, sir, is forfeited, like every honest man in Scotland. His estates is in the hands of the man they call King George, and it is his officers that collects the rents, or try to collect them. But for the honour of Scotland, the poor tenant bodies take a thought upon their chief lying in exile, and this money is a part of that very rent for which King George is looking. Now, sir, ye seem to me to be a man that understands things. Bring this money within the reach of government, and how much of it'll come to you?" "Little enough, to be sure," said Hoseason. And then, "if they knew," he added dryly. "But I think, if I was to try, that I could hold my tongue about it." "Ah, but I'll begawk you there," cried the gentleman. "Play me false, and I'll play you cunning. If a hand is laid upon me, they shall ken what money it is." "Well," returned the captain, "that must be must. 60 guineas, and done. Here's my hand upon it." "And here's mine," said the other. And thereupon the captain went out, rather hurriedly, I thought, and left me alone in the roundhouse with the stranger. At that period, so soon after the '45, there were many exiled gentlemen coming back at the peril of their lives, either to see their friends or to collect a little money; and as for the Highland chiefs that had been forfeited, it was a common matter of talk how their tenants would stint themselves to send them money, and their clansmen outfaced the soldiery to get it in, and run the gauntlet of our great navy to carry it across. All this I had, of course, heard tell of, and now I had a man under my eyes whose life was forfeit on all these counts and upon one more, for he was not only a rebel and a smuggler of rents, but he had taken service with King Louis of France. And as if all this were not enough, he had a belt full of golden guineas round his loins.
Whatever my opinions, I could not look on such a man without a lively interest. "And so you're a Jacobite?" said I, as I set meat before him.
"Ay," said he, beginning to eat. "And you, by your long face, should be a Whig?"
"Betwixt and between," said I, not to annoy him, but for indeed I was as good a Whig as Mr. Campbell could make me.
"And that's nothing," said he. "But I'm saying, Mr. Betwixt and Between," he added, "this bottle of yours is dry, and it's hard if I'm to pay 60 guineas and be grudged a dram upon the back of it."
"I'll go and ask for the key," said I, and stepped on deck. The fog was as close as ever, but the swell almost down. They had laid the brig to, not knowing precisely where they were, and the wind, what little there was of it, not serving well for their true course. Some of the hands were still hearkening for breakers, but the captain and the two officers were in the waist, with their heads together. It struck me, I don't know why, that they were after no good, and the first word I heard, as I drew softly near, more than confirmed me. It was Mr. Riach crying out as if upon a sudden thought, "Couldn't we whale him out of the Roundhouse?"
"He's better where he is," returned Hoseason. "He hasn't room to use his sword."
"Well, that's true," said Riach, "but he's hard to come at."
"Hut!" said Hoseason. "We can get the man in talk, one upon each side, and pin him by the two arms; or if that'll not hold, sir, we can make a run by both the doors, and get him under hand before he has the time to draw."
At this hearing I was seized with both fear and anger at these treacherous, greedy, bloody men that I sailed with. My first mind was to run away. My second was bolder. "Captain," said I, "the gentleman is seeking a dram, and the bottle's out. Will you give me the key?" They all started and turned about.
"Why, here's our chance to get the firearms!" Riach cried; and then to me, "Hark ye, David," he said, "do ye ken where the pistols are?"
"Ay, ay," put in Hoseason. "David kens. David's a good lad. Ye see, David, my man, yon wild Highlandman is a danger to the ship, besides being a rank foe to King George, God bless him."
I had never been so be-Davided since I came on board, but I said yes, as if all I heard were quite natural.
"The trouble is," resumed the captain,
"that all our firelocks, great and little, are in the Roundhouse under this man's nose. Likewise the powder. Now, if I or one of the officers was to go in and take them, he would fall to thinking. But a lad like you, David, might snap up a horn and a pistol or two without remark. And if ye can do it cleverly, I'll bear it in mind when it'll be good for you to have friends, and that's when we come to Carolina." Here Mr. Riach whispered him a little.
"Very right, sir," said the captain;
and then to myself,
"And see here, David, yon man has a belt full of gold,
and I give you my word that you shall have your fingers in it." I told him I would do as he wished, though indeed I had scarce breath to speak with, and upon that he gave me the key of the spirit locker, and I began to go slowly back to the Roundhouse. What was I to do? They were dogs and thieves. They had stolen me from my own country, they had killed poor Ransom, and was I to hold the candle to another murder? But then, upon the other hand, there was the fear of death very plain before me, for what could a boy and a man, if they were as brave as lions, against a whole ship's company? I was still arguing it back and forth, and getting no great clearness, when I came into the Roundhouse and saw the Jacobite eating his supper under the lamp, and at that my mind was made up all in a moment. I have no credit by it; it was by no choice of mine, but as if by compulsion, that I walked right up to the table and put my hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to be killed?" said I. He sprang to his feet, and looked a question at me as clear as if he had spoken. "Oh," cried I, "they're all murderers here; it's a ship full of them. They've murdered a boy already. Now it's you."
"Ay, ay," said he, "but they haven't got me yet."
And then looking at me curiously, "Will ye stand with me?"
"That will I," said I. "I am no thief, nor yet murderer. I'll stand by you." "Why, then," said he, "what's your name?" "David Balfour," said I; and then, thinking that a man with so fine a coat must like fine people, I added for the first time, "of Shaws." It never occurred to him to doubt me, for a Highlander is used to see great gentlefolk in great poverty; but as he had no estate of his own, my words nettled a very childish vanity he had. "My name is Stewart," he said, drawing himself up. "Alan Breck they call me. A king's name is good enough for me, though I bear it plain, and have the name of no farm midden to clap to the hind end of it." And having administered this rebuke, as though it were something of a chief importance, he turned to examine our defences. The Roundhouse was built very strong, to support the breaching of the seas. Of its 5 apertures, only the skylight and the 2 doors were large enough for the passage of a man. The doors, besides, could be drawn close. They were of stout oak, and ran in grooves, and were fitted with hooks to keep them either shut or open as the need arose. The one that was already shut I secured in this fashion; but when I was proceeding to slide to the other, Alan stopped me. "David," said he, "for I cannae bring to mind the name of your landed estate, and so will make so bold as to call ye David. That door being open is the best part of my defences." "It would be yet better shut," says I. "Not so, David," says he. "You see, I have but one face; but so long as that door is open and my face to it, the best part of my enemies will be in front of me, where I would aye wish to find them." Then he gave me from the rack a cutlass, of which there were a few besides the firearms, choosing it with great care, shaking his head and saying he had never in all his life seen poorer weapons; and next he set me down to the table with a powder horn, a bag of bullets, and all the pistols, which he bade me charge. "And that will be better work, let me tell you," said he, "for a gentleman of decent birth, than scraping plates and raxing drums to a wheen tarry sailors." Thereupon he stood up in the midst with his face to the door, and drawing his great sword, made trial of the room he had to wield it in. "I must stick to the point," he said, shaking his head, "and that's a pity too. It doesn't set my genius, which is all for the upper guard. And now," said he, "do you keep on charging the pistols, and give heed to me." I told him I would listen closely. My chest was tight, my mouth dry, the light dark to my eyes, and the thought of the numbers that were soon to leap in upon us kept my heart in a flutter. And the sea which I heard washing round the brig, and where I thought my dead body would be cast ere morning, ran in my mind strangely. "First of all," said he, "how many are against us?" I reckoned them up, and such was the hurry of my mind I had to cast the numbers twice. "15," said I. Alan whistled. "Well," said he, "that can't be cured. And now follow me. It is my part to keep this door, where I look for the main battle. In that ye have no hand. And mind and dinna fire to this side unless they get me down, for I would rather have 10 foes in front of me than one friend like you cracking pistols at my back." I told him, indeed, I was no great shot. "And that's very bravely said," he cried, in a great admiration of my candour. "There's many a pretty gentleman that wouldnae dare to say it." "But then, sir," said I, "there is the door behind you, which they may perhaps break in." "Ay," said he, "and that is the part of your work. No sooner the pistol's charged, than you must climb up into yon bed where you handy at the window; and if they lift hand against the door, ye're to shoot. But that's not all. Let's make a bit of a soldier of ye, David. What else have ye to guard?" "There's the skylight," said I. "But indeed, Mr. Stewart, I would need to have eyes upon both sides to keep the 2 of them, for when my face is at the one my back is to the other." "And that's very true," said Alan. "But have ye no ears to your head?" "To be sure," cried I. "I must hear the bursting of the glass." "Ye have some rudiments of sense," said Alan grimly.
End of chapter. Chapter 10 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 10. The Siege of the Roundhouse. But now our time of truce was come to an end. Those on deck had waited for my coming till they grew impatient, and scarce had Alan spoken when the captain showed face in the open door. "Stand!" cried Alan, and pointed his sword at him. The captain stood indeed, but he neither winced nor drew back a foot. "A naked sword," said he. "This is a strange return for hospitality." "D'ye see me?" said Alan. "I am come of kings. I bear a king's name. My badge is the oak. Do you see my sword? It has slashed the heads off more whigamores than you have toes upon your feet. Call up your vermin to your backs, sir, and fall on. The sooner the clash begins, the sooner you'll taste this steel through your vitals." The captain said nothing to Alan, but he looked over at me with an ugly look. "David," said he, "I'll mind this." And the sound of his voice went through me with a jar. Next moment he was gone. "And now," said Alan, "let your hand keep your head, for the grip is coming." Alan drew a dirk, which he held in his left hand in case they should run in under his sword. I, on my part, clambered up into the berth with an armful of pistols and something of a heavy heart, and set open the window where I was to watch. It was a small part of the deck that I could overlook, but enough for our purpose. The sea had gone down, and the wind was steady and kept the sails quiet, so that there was a great stillness in the ship, in which I made sure I heard the sound of muttering voices. A little after, and there came a clash of steel upon the deck, by which I knew they were dealing out the cutlasses, and one had been let fall, and after that, silence again. I do not know if I was what you call afraid, but my heart beat like a bird's, both quick and little, and there was a dimness come before my eyes which I continually rubbed away, and which continually returned. As for hope, I had none, but only a darkness of despair and a sort of anger against all the world that made me long to sell my life as dear as I was able. I tried to pray, I remember, but that same hurry of my mind, like a man running, would not suffer me to think upon the words, and my chief wish was to have the thing begin and be done with it. It came all of a sudden when it did, with a rush of feet and a roar, and then a shout from Alan, and a sound of blows and some one crying out as if hurt. I looked back over my shoulder and saw Mr. Shuan in the doorway, crossing blades with Alan. "That's him that killed the boy!" I cried. "Look to your window," said Alan, and as I turned back to my place, I saw him pass his sword through the mate's body. It was none too soon for me to look to my own part, for my head was scarce back at the window before 5 men, carrying a spare yard for a battering ram, ran past me and took post to drive the door in. I had never fired with a pistol in my life, and not often with a gun, far less against a fellow creature. But it was now or never, and just as they swang the yard I cried out, "Take that!" and shot into their midst. I must have hit one of them, for he sang out and gave back a step, and the rest stopped as if a little disconcerted. Before they had time to recover I sent another ball over their heads, and at my third shot, which went as wide as the second, the whole party threw down the yard and ran for it. Then I looked round again into the deck-house. The whole place was full of the smoke of my own firing, just as my ears seemed to be burst with the noise of the shots. But there was Alan, standing as before, only now his sword was running blood to the hilt, and himself so swelled with triumph and fallen into so fine an attitude that he looked to be invincible. Right before him on the floor was Mr. Shuan on his hands and knees. The blood was pouring from his mouth, and he was sinking slowly lower, with a terrible white face. And just as I looked, Some of those from behind caught hold of him by the heels and dragged him bodily out of the roundhouse. I believe he died as they were doing it. "There's one of your Whigs for you!" cried Alan, and then, turning to me, he asked if I had done much execution. I told him I had winged one, and thought it was the captain. "And I have settled two," says he. "No, there's not enough blood let. They'll be back again. To your watch, David. This was but a dram before meat." I settled back to my place, recharging the 3 pistols I had fired, and keeping watch with both eye and ear. Our enemies were disputing not far off upon the deck, and that so loudly that I could hear a word or two above the washing of the seas. "It was Shuan bockled," I heard one say, and another one answered him with a "Whisht, man, he's paid the piper." And after that the voices fell again into the same muttering as before. Only now one person spoke most of the time, as though laying down a plan, and first one and then another answered him briefly, like men taking orders. By this I made sure they were coming on again, and told Alan. "It's what we have to pray for," said he. "Unless we can give them a good distaste of us, and done with it, there'll be nae sleep for either you or me. But this time, mind, they'll be in earnest." By this my pistols were ready, and there was nothing to do but listen and wait. While the brush lasted, I had not the time to think if I was frighted; but now, when all was still again, my mind ran upon nothing else. The thought of the sharp swords and the cold steel was strong in me, and presently, when I began to hear stealthy steps and a brushing of men's clothes against the roundhouse wall, and knew they were taking their places in the dark, I could have found it in my mind to cry out aloud. All this was upon Alan's side, and I had begun to think my share of the fight was at an end, when I heard some one drop softly on the roof above me. Then there came a single call on the sea pipe, and that was the signal. A knot of them made one rush of it, cutlass in hand, against the door, and at the same moment the glass of the skylight was dashed in 1,000 pieces, and a man leaped through and landed on the floor. Before he got his feet, I had clapped a pistol to his back, and I might have shot him too, only at the touch of him, and him alive, my whole flesh misgave me, and I could no more pull the trigger than I could have flown. He had dropped his cutlass as he jumped, and when he felt the pistol, whipped straight around and laid hold of me, roaring out an oath; and at that, either my courage came again, or I grew so much afraid as came to the same thing, for I gave a shriek and shot him in the midst of the body. He gave the most horrible ugly groan and fell to the floor. The foot of a second fellow, whose legs were dangling through the skylight, struck me at the same time upon the head, and at that I snatched another pistol and shot this one through the thigh, so that he slipped through and tumbled in a lump on his companion's body. There was no talk of missing, any more than there was time to aim. I clapped the muzzle to the very place, and fired. I might have stood and stared at them for long, but I heard Alan shout as if for help, and that brought me to my senses. He had kept the door so long, but one of the seamen, while he was engaged with others, had run in under his guard and caught him about the body. Alan was dirking him with his left hand, but the fellow clung like a leech. Another had broken in and had his cutlass raised. The door was thronged with their faces. I thought we were lost, and catching up my cutlass, fell on them in flank. But I had not time to be of help. The wrestler dropped at last, and Alan, leaping back to get his distance, ran upon the others like a bull, roaring as he went. They broke before him like water, turning and running and falling one against another in their haste. The sword in his hands flashed like quicksilver into the huddle of our fleeing enemies, and at every flash there came the scream of a man hurt. I was still thinking we were lost, when, lo, they were all gone, and Alan was driving them along the deck, as a sheep-dog chases sheep. Yet he was no sooner out than he was back again, being as cautious as he was brave, and meanwhile the seamen continued running and crying out as if he was still behind them, and we heard them tumble one upon another into the forecastle, and clap to the hatch upon the top. The roundhouse was like a shambles. 3 were dead inside, another lay in his death agony across the threshold, and there were Alan and I,
victorious and unhurt. He came up to me with open arms. "Come to my arms!" he cried, and embraced and kissed me hard upon both cheeks. "David," said he, "I love you like a brother. And oh, man," he cried in a kind of ecstasy, "am I no a bonny fighter?" Thereupon he turned to the four enemies, passed his sword clean through each of them, and tumbled them out of doors one after the other. As he did so, he kept humming and singing and whistling to himself, like a man trying to recall an air. Only what he was trying was to make one. All the while the flush was in his face, and his eyes were as bright as a 5-year-old child's with a new toy. And presently he sat down upon the table, sword in hand. The air that he was making all the time began to run a little clearer, and then clearer still. And then out he burst with a great voice into a Gaelic song. I have translated it here, not in verse, of which I have no skill, but at least in the King's English. He sang it often afterwards, and the thing became popular, so that I have heard it and had it explained to me many's the time. "This is the song of the sword of Alan. The smith made it, the fire set it, now it shines in the hand of Alan Breck. Their eyes were many and bright, swift were they to behold, many the hands they guided, the sword was alone. The Dundeer troop over the hill, they are many, the hill is one, the Dundeer vanish, the hill remains. Come to me from the hills of heather, come from the isles of the sea, O far beholding eagles, here is your meat." Now this song which he made, both words and music, in the hour of our victory, is something less than just to me, who stood beside him in the tussle. Mr. Shuan and 5 more were either killed outright or thoroughly disabled, but of these 2 fell by my hand, the 2 that came by the skylight. 4 more were hurt, and of that number, 1, and he not the least important, got his hurt from me. So that altogether I did my fair share both of the killing and the wounding, and might have claimed a place in Alan's verses. But poets have to think upon their rhymes, and in good prose talk Alan always did me more than justice. In the meanwhile I was innocent of any wrong being done me, for not only I knew no word of the Gaelic, but what with the long suspense of the waiting, and the scurry and strain of our 2 spurts of fighting, and more than all, the horror I had of some of my own share in it, the thing was no sooner over than I was glad to stagger to a seat. There was that tightness on my chest that I could hardly breathe. The thought of the 2 men I had shot sat upon me like a nightmare. And all upon a sudden, and before I had a guess of what was coming, I began to sob and cry like any child. Alan clapped my shoulder, and said I was a brave lad, and wanted nothing but a sleep. "I'll take the first watch," said he. "You've done well by me, David, first and last, and I wouldn't lose you for all Appin. No, nor for Breadalbane." So I made up my bed on the floor, and he took the first spell, pistol in hand and sword on knee, 3 hours by the captain's watch upon the wall. Then he roused me up, and I took my turn of 3 hours, before the end of which it was broad day, and a very quiet morning, with a smooth rolling sea that tossed the ship and made the blood run to and fro on the roundhouse floor, and a heavy rain that drummed upon the roof. All my watch there was nothing stirring, and by the banging of the helm I knew they had even no one at the tiller. Indeed, as I learned afterwards, there were so many of them hurt or dead, and the rest in so ill a temper, that Mr. Riach and the captain had to take turn and turn like Alan and me, or the brig might have gone ashore, and nobody the wiser. It was a mercy the night had fallen so still, for the wind had gone down as soon as the rain began. Even as it was, I judged by the wailing of a great number of gulls that went crying and fishing round the ship, that she must have drifted pretty near the coast, or one of the islands of the Hebrides; and at last, looking out of the door of the roundhouse, I saw the great stone hills of Skye on the right hand, and, a little more astern, the strange isle of Rum. End of chapter.